As we turn now to Mexico and to what's happening south of the border and the border wars, Juan.
Well, the so-called war on drugs is a hot-button topic of the day in Mexico. On Tuesday, President Felipe Calderón summoned legislators to take part in ongoing discussions about the issue. The Mexican government's policy over the past few years has been to increasingly militarize the conflict, with the only tangible result being a skyrocketing death toll. But there is a growing movement in Mexico to legalize drugs, particularly marijuana, that is beginning to take hold. Last week, President Calderón said he would support a national debate on legalizing drugs, reversing his previous stance. However, he did underscore that he does not favor legalization. His announcement came in the wake of a government report that found that more than 28,000 people have been killed in drug-related violence since a U.S.-backed military crackdown on cartels began 3.5 years ago when Calderón took office. More than 6,000 people have been killed in the border city of Ciudad Juarez alone, making it ground zero in the so-called drug war.
4 proposals that aim for varying degrees of decriminalization or legalization of drugs are on the docket in Mexico's House of Deputies. Another is circulating in the Senate. Meanwhile, former Mexican President Vicente Fox, who is a key U.S. ally in the war on drugs, has backed the legalization of drugs, saying prohibition has failed to reduce violence and corruption.
I have proposed the legalization of drugs because I think it is not the responsibility of the government. What we are asking to withdraw the drugs from the market, and so that as a result our children could be free from the temptation of going and consuming drugs. That is not possible. That will never happen. All prohibition seems to provoke the contrary effect. All prohibition, what it does is to bring more interest in going for the apple in the case of Adam and Eve, or to go for the cigarette, or the alcohol in Chicago. What you see in Holland and in other European countries that have let it go, they released the drug, and consumption has not significantly increased.
Again, that was the former president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, a close Bush ally who, before that, was head of Coca-Cola in Mexico. Last year, another former Mexican president, Ernesto Zedillo, pressed for decriminalization in a widely publicized report produced with former leaders of Colombia and Brazil. For more on the issue, we're joined on the phone by Victor Clark Alfaro, the director of the Binational Center for Human Rights in Tijuana and a lecturer in Latin American Studies Department at San Diego. And joining us on the phone from Mexico City, Laura Carlson, the director of the America's Policy Program of the Center for International Policy. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Laura Carlson, explain what's happening in the Mexican legislature.
Have been there for a while, and they have been developed by grassroots organizations that insist that legalization is not only a step in ending this violent crime campaign against organized crime, but also necessary for human rights and for the proper treatment of drug consumers within the country. However, these measures have really not moved, and it's very unlikely that they'll move in the near future. There doesn't seem to be a consensus within Mexico that this kind of a proposal is politically viable. In fact, President Calderón threw out this mention of legalization of drugs as part of his series of consultations with different sectors of Mexican society in what he calls a dialogue on the security strategy, and said that the pros and cons should be analyzed, and immediately followed up, as he mentioned, by opposing legalization. For a lot of people, this was meant to be a red herring. And rather than being a serious proposal, it's not backed up by any procedures for analyzing it or by mandating any studies of the real impact of legalization on organized crime, that it was meant to distract attention from the fact that this dialogue is revealing the deep discontent and lack of confidence in Calderón's U.S.-backed drug war. There's really no question that legalization of drugs is a positive part of a real analysis of a more viable alternative to this failing drug war. But right now we're not seeing this as viable, and it's doubtful that Calderón has any intention of really changing the drug war model.
Victor Clark Alfaro, you have been going back and forth for years along the border, especially between Tijuana and Southern California. What has been the impact in the city of Tijuana, especially in the last few years, of this militarization of the drug war?
Well, there is diminishing the quality of life and human rights, the increasing number of human rights violations from the militaries, the image of the border of our border cities or the country as a whole abroad. The war has not affected, at least in Tijuana, the business of drugs. Until now are very successful. I thought this process of increasing militarization. And we don't see a solution at the end, at least until now, with this strategy of President Calderon.
Well, when ex-President Vicente Fox made his statement a couple of weeks ago, he especially pointed to the fact that this militarization and the war on drugs has created huge problems in terms of drops in tourism for Mexico and also of the business of the maquiladoras along the border in Mexico. What the economic impact of this continued war? Could you talk about that?
Well, in the case of Tijuana, we used to have millions of border visitors coming to Tijuana. By 1990, there were 19 million border visitors. By 1988, there were 4 million border visitors, especially U.S. citizens. But probably last year there were less than 500,000 visitors to our city. Actually, the tourist industry just collapsed in Tijuana, not only as a consequence of the image of violence of our city abroad, but different issues, the long lines to cross to the, waiting online to cross to the U.S. side, the lack of publicity of Tijuana abroad, the corruption of the municipal police extorting tourists, a lot of other elements provoke, including the image of violence, and the violence itself provoke a collapse in the tourist industry, not only in Tijuana, but in other border cities, and obviously with an important impact in our cities, because tourism is one of the main, or used to be one of the main incomes in our cities.
And Laura Carlson, there have been several reports by the State Department in recent years that the cultivation of drug crops in Mexico, not only marijuana, obviously, but also opium, have increased dramatically in recent years. Some people attribute that to the increasing number of peasants thrown off the land as a result of NAFTA, that they don't have anything. The only way to make decent income is to resort to drug cultivation. Can you talk about the impact of the drug war in the countryside?
That's true. According to statistics, there is an increase in the amount of drugs that are being grown in the countryside. And there's no question in my mind that this is a direct result of the fact that legal crops, food crops that we so much need here in Mexico, where there is a problem of hunger, have been displaced by organized crime coming in and offering everything that the government doesn't offer: a higher price for the product, credit, seeds, the kinds of conditions that farmers need in order to cultivate. And in these conditions, peasants are changing to drug crops. The problem now is that the drug war is becoming an excuse also to go into the countryside and repress certain areas and organizations that are independent. We're seeing a real problem with what we call the criminalization of social protest. So indigenous movements and other campesino peasant movements are being repressed and occupied in some cases by the military under the excuse of the drug war. Meanwhile, there's a complete lack of coherency in the policies that are coming out of Mexico and out of the United States in order to deal with this problem. There's basic root causes that have to do with a population that doesn't have jobs, a population that's been immersed in poverty with the financial crisis. There's an estimated 5.8 million more Mexicans in poverty now than there were before. And this makes it easy pickings for cartels to recruit young people who don't have other futures and to enter into areas like these rural areas where they're able to convince people to grow illicit drug crops because they have few other viable choices.
Laura Carlson, what about the U.S. backing for the war on drugs and what this means?
I think it's really an insult to the Mexican people that as this dialogue is progressing and it becomes so clear that the majority of the people do not believe that it's a winnable war, that they're angry at their president for immersing the country in a strategy that's led to a spiraling of violence, up to 28,000 people, as was mentioned, plus a huge increase in human rights violations against the army, which is now in the streets, nearly 50,000 troops fighting this supposed war, that in the United States no one's taking note of this. And the strategy continues to be supported through the Merida Initiative. In fact, Congress just appropriated an additional $175 million to Mexico for the drug war in the supplemental appropriations. And there's another $310 million that's included in the 2011 budget. So this 3-year plan to support the Mexican drug war that Bush designed is now turned into an indefinite plan under the Obama administration, despite the fact that there's been no real assessment that every indicator virtually that we have that's a serious indicator of actually weakening organized crime or of the impact on Mexican society is completely negative. And the plan itself has no benchmarks, so there's no way to really evaluate what success would even look like in this case. They know they can't wipe out cartels because that's never been done. And so there's not an exit strategy, there's no measure of success, and we keep throwing money at a problem that is literally holding the Mexican people hostage to a badly conceived and implemented security strategy.
Victor Clark, what do you think are the prospects of any change in a government policy in terms of legalization, especially now that 2 former presidents, Ernesto Zedillo and Vicente Fox, have both urged decriminalization? In case of Fox, he's saying legalize the production and the sale completely.
To be honest, I don't think it will happen. It is only a discussion and a sympathy with specific and focalized groups. But I don't see a sympathy from the majority of our population, probably because lack of information, because prejudice. And I don't think it is going to happen, really. It is only a discussion, especially in academic sectors, with intellectuals, with these 2 former presidents. But at the end, it is not going to happen, nothing. But also, we have now the example of the U.S. in the case of California and other states that are now discussing the possibility of legalization of marijuana. That send messages to our country also.
Let's go to the related issue of militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border. On Friday, President Obama signed into law a $600 million bill to deploy some 1,500 new Border Patrol agents and law enforcement officials along the border, as well as 2 aerial surveillance drones. The bill was quickly passed by Congress in a rare display of bipartisanship. For more on this issue, we're going to turn to Arnaldo Garcia, the program director of the Immigrant Justice and Rights Program at National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. He's joining us from the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Arnaldo. What about this issue and your assessment of what Congress passed?
Well, the U.S. has been militarizing immigration control and border communities for the last 15 years, and it has consisted of deliberately funneling migrants to cross through the most dangerous and desolate parts of the desert region, and basically pushing people to enter through Arizona if they risk their lives that way. On the U.S. side, there's an average of the remains of 2 migrants are found on the U.S. side, and human rights groups that are tracking the deaths and trying to prevent people from dying in the desert estimate that for each migrant remain found, there's at least 10 other people missing. So not only are migrants the casualties of this militarization of the